Dead zones, areas in the ocean with thousands upon thousands of miles, are covered with algae, blocking out the sunlight from the depths below. The water underneath stays stagnant, limiting any life and growth. Just how deadly are these patches of darkness, and how heavily can it impact us?
Hi, I'm Jonathan, former biology and chemistry student at Wellington High School. So, dead zones are caused by runoff fertilizers from farmlands because in the late 20th century, farmers developed a new method of increasing plant growth, and that was called fertilizers. Now, back in those days, science was not as advanced, and they didn't really think about what environmental effects fertilizers would have. Come here. One big effect of fertilizers on the oceans was the growth of algae. This algae is the direct result of runoff fertilizers. And this process is called eutrophication. Now, if you look closely, you can notice that there's less sunlight underneath the algae compared to on top. This is a plant. Every green plant requires two main things to make sugar, and sugar is what enables plants to live. One thing is carbon dioxide, and the second one is sunlight. So at the bottom of the ocean, underneath all this algae, there is no sunlight. Therefore, there is no glucose or sugar. Now, because plants are at the bottom of the food chain, everything on top goes down with it. For example, fishes, crabs, shrimps, seals, sea otters, everything is dead because the plants are dead. Hi, so now I'm going to be meeting with my former colleagues so that we can give you a better visualization of what's going on inside of dead zones.
Now let's look at how dead zones actually happen. First, you have farms all over the United States. Now, they regularly use fertilizer in their farming. But what happens to this fertilizer? This fertilizer goes into their nearby water source, which is usually a stream, and then eventually ends up in the ocean. In this case, the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this fertilizer then spreads into the ocean, coating the ocean surface. Let's look at this in greater detail. Here we have warm water coming in from the stream. Now, warm water is, of course, warm, so it floats on top of the seawater, and thus this fertilizer floats on top as well. On this fertilizer, because it is nutrient rich, a lot of algae starts to grow on this fertilizer. This algae then blocks out the sunlight from reaching the plants below, killing them. The first animals to be impacted by this are the mainly plant-eating animals, such as sea turtles, and they're the first ones to die. The next to die are the animals that eat sea otters, such as sharks. However, this gets worse. As algae starts to die from this fertilizer, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and bacteria begins to feed on this algae. As the bacteria feeds, they start taking in oxygen from the nearby water and consuming it, thus creating a low level of oxygen in the water. And in the end, this leads to a dead zone.
Now that you know the basics, let's talk to a professional and ask them, what are the long-term effects of dead zones?
Okay, so the impacts of dead zones is that From fertilizer runoff, usually what will happen is the oxygen gets sucked out of the area, otherwise known as hypoxia, and when it gets sucked out, there's no life there. Over the long term, the impacts of dead zones could be very detrimental to an ecosystem, because as more and more fertilizer runoff goes into the area, the larger these dead zones will become, and the less biodiversity there is in that particular area.
So in terms of dead zones in the ocean, my number one piece of advice would be to really work on the types of chemicals and the toxicity of the chemicals that we use. A lot of these fertilizers and chemicals that we use in everyday lives are not necessarily used responsibly. Companies need to be more held more accountable for where these chemicals go, how they're disposed, runoff, etc. And as a result, if they were held more accountable for these things, then these issues would be at least less severe, and if they were less severe, maybe more manageable for us to do.
We need to be more environmentally responsible. As the dominant species of this planet, we have a moral obligation to protect those who are less evolved compared to us. Humans have learned how to fully utilize their tools to make their lives easier, but at what cost? If we look back at history, humans have always been taking advantage of the rest of the animals. But the truth is, we have never owned it. We don't own these animals. This planet is meant to be shared with all of its wildlife. It is not meant to be abused. So go to your local representatives and pressure them to make the right decisions that can save the lives of animals being affected by not only the dead zones, but every human atrocity towards other animals in other places.